Kata is something you practice, not something you watch. Read the lesson, write the code yourself, then review what you wrote. This video is the reference you come back to afterwards. A model can produce this code in seconds, and the reason to write it by hand is to keep the judgment that tells you whether the code is any good. A custom hook is a function. That is the entire mechanism, and it is worth saying first because people expect there to be more. There is no registration step, no special export, nothing React has to be told about. If a function's name begins with use and it calls other hooks, it is a custom hook, and the only thing that makes the name matter is a lint rule. What you get for that is the ability to move stateful logic out of a component and into something you can name, test, and reuse, and this lesson builds 5 of them. The rules are short. The name starts with use because the linter uses that prefix to decide where the rules of hooks apply. It can call other hooks, which ordinary functions cannot. And it runs as part of the component that called it, which is the part we're dwelling on. A custom hook is not a shared object, and it does not create anything global. Every component that calls it gets its own state, its own effects, its own everything. Two components using the same hook are as independent as two components using useState directly, because that is literally what is happening one level down. The first one wraps a piece of state that also persists. It reads the stored value once for the initial state and writes back whenever the value changes. Look at what it returns, a value and a setter, the same shape as useState. That is the convention worth copying. A hook that returns the same shape as the built-in it wraps can be dropped into a component with almost no thought. One detail hiding in this example, reading from storage in the initializer rather than in an effect means the first render already has the stored value, so nothing flashes the default before correcting itself. This one subscribes to something outside React and hands back the current value. Set state to the size on mount, add a resize listener, remove it in the cleanup. Every component calling it gets the size and re-renders when the window changes. The interesting question is what happens with 10 components calling it, and the answer is 10 listeners because each call runs its own effect. That is fine at this scale, and it is exactly the kind of thing worth knowing before you use a hook like this in a list. The fix when you need it is one subscription in a context, which is a later lesson. Debounce is the one that shows why hooks compose. Take a value, return a copy of it that only catches up once the input has stopped changing for a while. Inside, it is the pattern from the cleanup lesson, an effect with a timeout and a cleanup that clears it, so every change cancels the pending update and starts a new one. The whole hook is about 6 lines. Then a search box uses it by calling it on the input value and putting the result in the dependency array of the fetch, and the debouncing disappears from the component entirely. The smallest hook here, and a good example of when to stop, it holds a boolean and returns it with a function that flips it. That is all. It earns its place because the alternative appears in every component that has a modal or a panel, and because the flip function is stable and named rather than an inline arrow that inverts the value. Do not overextend this one. The moment a toggle needs 3 states, it is not a toggle anymore, and forcing it through a hook called useToggle is worse than the 2 lines it replaced. The previous value trick from the useref lesson wrapped up a ref, an effect that writes the current value into it after the render, and a return of what the ref held, which is to say the hook returns the value from the previous render because the write happens after everyone has read it. It is 4 lines, and it is genuinely hard to get right from memory, which is the best possible argument for extracting something into a hook, not because it is long, but because it is subtle and you want to reason about it once. The list on screen is sound, and there are 2 entries worth waiting. Start the name with use always, because that is what tells the linter to check the rules of hooks inside it, and a hook that skips the prefix loses that checking silently. And extract logic used in more than one place. That second one is a limit as much as a permission. A hook pulled out of a single component used once tends to move the code away from where it is read without making it reusable, and now the state lives in one file and the markup that depends on it lives in another. Custom hooks are ordinary functions that call hooks. The prefix is what makes lint work. Each call gets its own independent state, so sharing a hook shares the logic, never the data. Return the same shape as the built-in you are wrapping when you can, and extract when the logic is repeated or when it is subtle enough to be worth reasoning about once and never again. Two components, and both of them do the same three things. Read a value from local storage for their initial state, keep it in state, and write it back whenever it changes. The logic is not complicated, but it is duplicated exactly, including the JSON parse and the try around it. This is the state a code base reaches naturally, and the cost is not the extra lines. It is that a bug in the parsing is now a bug in two places, and the third component that needs this will be written by copying one of these two. The same two components with the shared part lifted into one hook. Each component is now one line of hook call plus its own markup, and the storage logic exists once. The thing to look at is the independence. Both components call the same hook with different keys, and neither can see the other's value. Nothing is shared except the code. That is the property that makes custom hooks safe to use everywhere, and it is the one people are least sure about when they start. The last variant is a small library of them in one file, so you can read them against each other. A toggle, a previous value, a window size, a debounce. Read them in order and notice how little there is to each one and how different their internals are. One holds state, one holds a ref, one subscribes to the window, one runs a timer with a cleanup. What they share is not their implementation, it is their shape. A function whose name begins with use that calls hooks and that returns something useful. Once that shape is familiar, the question stops being how to write a custom hook and becomes which piece of your component deserves to be one. The model to keep is that there is no such thing as a custom hook, only functions that are allowed to call hooks. That is why each call gets its own state, why they compose without any special machinery, and why the whole feature has almost no API surface to learn. When a piece of logic is repeated or subtle or has an obvious name, give it one and move it out. When it is none of those, leave it where it is. The kata is the part that matters. Open the lesson, write the code yourself, then read back what you wrote and judge it. The link is in the description, and that practice is what keeps the skill yours.